Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. Hi. Are we ready to get going? My cats that I'm always hurting. Okay, well, welcome back on Women in Art series. Jenny, you're right on time. Um, Welcome to people that weren't able to come last week. Great to see you. I know also it was Yom Kippur, so I'm promising to do an extra intense review of Julia Morgan. I don't think we'll mind, just to kind of re-solidify what we learned. I also made an announcement that I'm having a trip. It's the Julia Morgan tour of we're doing 3 days, March 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th. We're following Julia Morgan. We're going up to Berkeley, going to stay 2 nights at the Berkeley City Club, and then we're going to go stay in Asilomar, which is she designed, and then we're going to go to Hearst Castle, like talk to Hearst Castle, by some miracle got through, and we've got extra spots in the special Julia Morgan tour at Hearst Castle. So it's all looking good. And I haven't put it online or anything, but I also did remind everyone that this is it's a Julia Morgan. Our accommodation, which is included in the price of this tour, is it's architectural first, luxury second. So it's so that needs to be factored in for you on, if luxury is number one for you, it's probably not the right, especially Asilomar, which was designed as a YMCA camp. So, but it's like going to be really cool and, awesome that we're there. So that's part of it. I'm definitely want that to be clear and upfront. And I haven't posted this on the internet yet. I'm letting you guys have a crack at it. And I think I'm capping it at 20. Okay. Okay, so in that light, we're going to do our review of our Julia Morgan lecture. And just before the sounds good to me. Is it okay for you guys in the back? Okay, good. Here is Julia Morgan as a young woman. She was from Oakland, California. She is our California girl. She was from a very, well-to-do. Her mother was from a well-to-do family from New York, from Brooklyn. They came to Oakland. She lived in a beautiful Victorian house there. She was a very smart student. She went to Berkeley when it looked like that in 1897. And she was, well, no, she was there. When was she there? She was there before that, in the 1880s, and late 1880s. Anyways, she was a very good student. Berkeley did not have an architecture program at the time, so she was an engineering student, and she got her degree in engineering. And then her life was affected by two very important mentors. She started working upon graduation with Bernard Maybeck, who she met at a class in San Francisco, who was a very prominent architect in the Bay Area. And he took her under her wing. Bernard Maybeck was very much connected with Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who was the kind of grand doyenne of American California philanthropy. She, of course, was married to a very rich husband who made his money. Remember, he actually struck the Comstock lode, right? He was the one who made a good fortune in silver mining in Nevada, then copper mining, and then came to California. And when he died, she inherited what was the equivalent of $540 million. So she was one of the richest equivalent women in America at the time. And she had been a school teacher, so she was very interested in education and kind of women's philanthropies. And so she bankrolled the development of UC Berkeley. And she will hire Bernard Maybeck to kind of oversee it. And together they came up with the plan of creating Berkeley as the Athens of the West. And they had a competition, and he was very, very involved in that. So Julia, working for Maybeck, also therefore became involved, particularly in building a giant mountain home for Phoebe Hearst. While Julia is working for him doing that as a young 20-year-old, he is so impressed with her that he encourages her to go to Paris and take up studies at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he had gone to school. She was the first woman ever to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts. They had just opened it to women artists, and we talked all about that. We looked at many of her work that she did while she was in Paris. It took her a year of applying to the school. She had to apply 3 times. And remember, we learned about that application process, like what a nightmare it was. Including an all-day math exam, oral math exam in a crowded room, which literally the stuff of nightmares. But she was, of course, incredibly accomplished, and she uh, gained entry into the École des Beaux-Arts, where, interestingly, they had a system where the students didn't sign their name to their work for fairness, and that really worked to her advantage. So she won many gold medals and did very well once she was inside of the system. And here's one of her designs for a window of a theater, and that's what they would do. Design a theater, whatever. Here was her final project, and once she was admitted, she had to finish a 6-year degree in 3 years, because they had a rule that you had to finish but by the time you were 30 years old. So she was extremely distinguished student, and basically they ran her through the école education, which was basically based in drawing, and kind of taught her a whole range of architectural idioms or vocabularies, Renaissance, Baroque. She could do anything. She had an extraordinary broad education, and here was her final exam. Basically, she would have to come up with a sketch for a theater and a palace, and then she had to do all of the kind of the dimensions and everything, and then submit a final finished plan. So it was very, very impressive accomplishment to do this. And be the only woman. When she came back, she right away got a job. No surprise. I mean, this was kind of followed in the California papers as well, and her accomplishments were celebrated. Phoebe Apperson Hearst was there, came to Paris, was in Paris when she gained admission to the École. It was very well known. When she comes back to Oakland, she gets her first real project as the architect of note, and that was doing the campanile at Mills College for one of Phoebe's friends. Did someone say who? Oh, no. I think it was Molly Smith was the name. Remember, she was the wife of the borax king who made his money in borax, and he was one of the richest men of Oakland. So she designed this campanile, and it's a very early kind of iteration of what will become mission style, right? This kind of colonial mission Spanish architecture. She ran into trouble, you'll recall, with the contractor who she was very ahead of her time, and she was the first to really use reinforced concrete in her architecture. And she was using reinforced concrete. The contractor considered himself an expert on this new material, and challenged her design, wanting it to be different dimensions. Yeah. Hmm. She did. Yeah. Yeah, of course. She was an incredible mathematician as well. That should be said. Yeah, right. She loved building. She loved the whole thing. And of course, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, she was female, so this was her first, taste of, and we talked about this in the lecture, how she, submitted all of her drawings. I mean, and the contractor said, no, this is wrong. And then he went to Molly Smith's husband, the actual Borax King, and said, oh no, she's got it wrong. And the husband trumped his wife, who was the one that actually commissioned the structure, and they had to change the design. I mean, change the specifications. And she learned never again would she outsource, have a contractor she didn't know or wasn't part of her practice. So it was a kind of an important learning experience. It turns out that this was an incredibly important project for her because, as we learned in lecture, in 1911, there was a massive earthquake in the Bay Area, basically devastated San Francisco because there was a horrible fire in the aftermath of the quake. The Fairmont building was, burned out. It had just been built. Many structures were destroyed all through the Bay Area, but her campanile survived, and because of that, she was recognized as an architect of note, and she was hired to basically revamp the Fairmont, and she did within 1 year bring it back. Might not be quite like that at the time, but it was brought back under budget, on time. She moved into the Fairmont. She just threw herself into the whole project. And from that point onward, I mean, she never looked back. We also learned that at the time, she went into a joint practice with another architect named Hoover because there was so much need for housing in the aftermath of that quake. And did I say 1911? So it was 1905, right? Yeah, sorry. 1906, thank you. And she started building houses, and anyone that spent any time in Berkeley knows that this is the housing of Berkeley, and she designed it basically. This kind of brown shingle architecture, it's called. It's a great example of Bay Area arts and crafts, where she kind of oriented the building, kind of vertically on the site, right? So you enter down the side and up through the side. So you weren't kind of faced with the kind of Victorian style railroad layout of a structure, kind of 2-story, big windows. We looked at one of the high end versions of these. And she did very, very well doing that. This is another example of that, the St. John's Presbyterian Church, now the Berkeley Theater, where she's, using and developing arts and Bay Area arts and crafts, using kind of barn vernacular in this use of kind of extraordinary wood detailing in the interior and the exterior, a beloved Berkeley landmark. Once again, Phoebe Apperson Hearst involves herself in the background of Julia's life and secures for her or introduces her to the YWCA, who hires her to build the Oakland Y, which at the time was a really important building. They spent about $5 million on this building. It was very important housing for young women who were moving en masse out of kind of rural areas into urban centers. And Julia Morgan really envisioned it within the kind of Renaissance Italianate vocabulary, and she goes on to do, I think, over 30 YWCAs across California. This is kind of one of the premier examples of it, as is the building in Long Beach was another one, which now is destroyed. She was also hired by the YWCA to build the Asilomar Conference Center, where they would have their annual meetings. Once again, Phoebe Hearst organized to have the land donated to them. And there's more structures designed by Julia Morgan at Asilomar than anywhere else. And so it's a concentration of her work. We can see this arts and crafts design. We can see the river rock, right, goes kind of all the way up to this kind of redwood entablature above. The interior of these buildings, with extraordinary kind of attention to wood detailing. She worked on it for quite a while. Here's one of the buildings she did in the 1920s, while she's also, of course, working at Hearst Castle at this point. A kind of idyllic place with kind of beautiful ocean views, which were taken into account in the Merrill Hall. Here's the interior, very, very beautiful. She becomes friendly with William Randolph Hearst, Phoebe's son, who hires her to design the Herald Examiner building in 1914. He was very devoted to the kind of mission style. This is kind of more of a Spanish mission style. We have that kind of Moorish sensibility and detail in this work. And ultimately, yeah, she has a very dedicated staff who's working with her. She was a very an exacting boss. We looked at this, and people worked for her for years on end. She had a staff of, I think it was about 38 employees at one point. Yeah, she had a big office at one point, but there was a core, 10 employees that were with her for life, kind of thing. There is her award-winning Berkeley Women's City Club. Unfortunately, I forgot to throw in the slide of the pool, which is the highlight of this. This is the interior where we see her, using kind of showing off her skill set of kind of turning to the Romanesque, using a whole series of kind of complex growing vault ceilings to create this kind of warm, beautiful interior for the city club. The pool there is to die for. I'm so sorry I didn't bring the slide. And of course, around 1920, she starts to work with William Randolph Hearst, building his dream home at San Simeon, his family property. And this was an incredible undertaking, which took all of the wherewithal of her abilities as a civil engineer to basically build a palace where there was nothing. She's bringing electricity, plumbing, everything into this site. And she works on this for, nonstop for over 15 years. Okay. So that's about as extensive as in a review. I'm almost tired. I need to revitalize. But I promised. I felt bad that we started on Yom Kippur, so I definitely wanted to have a good, very thorough review. Okay, so here we go. Peggy Guggenheim. How amazing is she? She is interesting character for sure. Perhaps one of the most influential patrons of the arts in the 20th century. She will be a staunch advocate for surrealism and abstract expressionism, and she's going to play a really major role in bringing European art to the American scene in the middle of the 20th century. Today, we're going to look at her life, which was extraordinary. She was incredibly independently minded, very liberated and free in her social interaction, particularly with men in an era where this was very unusual. This tarnished her reputation somewhat in her own lifetime, but so interestingly, it doesn't affect the way we see her today at all. So kind of interesting. She was able to build a substantial art collection in the early years of World War II, when artists were basically desperate to sell their work, and there were very few collectors out buying it. And from this core collection, she's going to create an incredibly important gallery in the United States, the Art of the Century, it was called, in New York. And then later, in her own museum in Venice, Italy, where we see her pictured here. And that is, of course, now the Guggenheim Museum, Venice, which still bears her name today. So we assume that Peggy Guggenheim was privy to every luxury because of a great family fortune. However, that was not really the case with Peggy Guggenheim. She was born in 1898, one of three daughters to Benjamin Guggenheim and Florette Siegelman Guggenheim. Benjamin, Peggy's father, objected when the Guggenheim family decided to shift its privately owned family oil business into Guggenex, which was a corporate entity that would allow outside investors, which was probably one of the stupidest financial decisions he could have made, because he pulls out, and at that time, the Guggenheim family corporation will start to invest heavily in refining interest and mining interest around the world. Therefore kind of enjoying an explosive financial success. Instead, Benjamin decided to go out on his own, dabbling in his own investments, all of which came to nothing. Furthermore, he was kind of a womanizer, decided to leave the family often, had many girlfriends. At one time, he was living with a girlfriend in Europe for an extended period of time. Decided to come home, made the somewhat unwise decision to book a ticket on the Titanic. Needless to say, he didn't make it home. Ultimately, each of his teenage daughters inherited about $450,000. Hardly a grand, limitless fortune, but certainly enough to be comfortable. And of course, Peggy did grow up in great affluence, and her family all around her were occasional benefactors and helped her, although she herself was not super rich by any means. Yeah, that was the original amount, which what would it be? I wanted to look it up. I didn't have time. I was thinking like around $6 million. It wasn't like crazy money, right? It was a lot of money. Yeah, it would be like that. And also, she was smart because, as we'll see, she hung out with artists who had nothing. So, amongst that milieu, she was loaded. But amongst her own people, the Guggenheims, she was the poor family member. So, it was one of those scenarios. No, she wasn't starving. Early on, Peggy was drawn to kind of bohemian types. As a teenager in 1920, she took a job at a cousin's edgy bookshop called Sunwise Turn, which was located near Grand Central Station. She worked there for free, but could receive a discount on books. And she was kind of a voracious reader. And there, she liked the vibe and the people that she met. And she met all sorts of interesting people, including Alfred Stieglitz, who hung out there, who actually showed her a work by his girlfriend at the time, George O'Keeffe. And it was one of the first abstract paintings that she ever saw. She'll meet all sorts of really, interesting people, and of course, including interesting young men. And she will meet Lawrence Vale there, an artist and a writer. And he will go on to be incredibly influential in her life. And in fact, there he is. 10 million. Okay, good. Thank you. Gosh, you should be on payroll. You're really, you're really helpful. Um, so she meets Lawrence Vale, and she meets him at the bookshop, and then she moves to Paris. She decides that she wants to go to Paris the following summer. And once they're there, she strikes up romance with him that will basically kind of, find full flower in Paris. And he's quite different than the milieu that she knows in New York. He's not Jewish. He's very reckless with money, kind of a wastrel in a way, but extremely knowledgeable about art and culture. And she's going to find him incredibly attractive and compelling. And with him is going to spend a lot of time drinking in Parisian cafes And through him, Peggy is going to find herself in the center of a very intense intellectual, artistic, social life in Paris, which included the likes of Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, surrealist artist Andre Masson was there. This is Montparnasse in the 20s. Picasso's there, the surrealist, and she's going to marry Lawrence Vail. And together, they're going to have this kind of really fabulous life together. They're going to love to dress extravagantly. They attended costume parties. We see her here. It's a famous photograph of her by Man Ray, wearing a glamorous gold lame evening gown designed for her by the famous couturier Paul Poiret, who designed all the costumes for the Ballet Russe. So he was really the costumier, and she's right in there, friends with him. She has this fabulous headdress that she has on, which was made and designed for her by Vera Sudin, who was the mistress of Igor Stravinsky. So, she's really kind of part of it in the in crowd during a really extraordinary time in Paris. Of course, she's married, so she's going to have kids. Here she is, almost right away. Lawrence Vail and Peggy have a family. These are her two children, Sinbad and Pegeen. The arrival of the kids didn't seem to slow them down too much. She continued to travel around Europe, enjoyed Venice, continued to attend parties and socialize. A very different experience of young motherhood than I had, that's for sure. Here is a portrait of her at this time that really kind of captures her. This was done by her friend, an artist named Alfred Cormet, who had spent time with the Vails when they lived in the south of France for half of a year. They rented a house from Jean Cocteau. In the portrait here, we see the 28-year-old Peggy wearing a very fashionable yet kind of edgy geometric outfit. She has kind of an intense stare. The background depicts the coast of France with the couple's house and a flashy car behind them. There is a classical sensibility to the work, though, right? It's comprised here of a certain conservative decorum, and many people did note this about Peggy Guggenheim. Even as she surrounded herself by these kind of wild bohemians, there was a kind of an understatedness to her. Although we see those earrings, big earrings, this was kind of a special love of hers. She will, throughout her life, have quite an earring collection. She'll have earrings designed for her by Picasso, were a favorite. Alexander Calder designed her some earrings for her that she loved to wear. So she was kind of an interesting kind of combination of kind of a stateliness and also very, very bohemian. Her husband at the time, Lawrence Vail, was a writer. Finally published his book that he had been writing through this 10 years. It was called Murder, Murder, which was, I guess, kind of funny, but also a bit of a hurtful satire of their life together. At one point, while they're living in Paris in 1926, Peggy is going to get a job for fun. She's going to sell lamps with the cousin in kind of a high-end shop in Paris. And at that point, she's going to find that she's going to kind of has a talent for sales, which will be kind of fun for her. She's also going to meet a new man named John Holmes, who was an English writer. And she is going to fall madly and passionately in love with him. And I guess he was very handsome and athletic body, kind of notoriously charismatic and fit. And we see him here. She's just going to go all in with him, kind of divorce Lawrence Vail. Uh, they will decide to split the kids. She'll take Peggy, he'll take Sinbad, and she will kind of set up house with John Holmes and have kind of a couple years of blissful happiness. Although he suffered horribly from writer's block, and one book I read suggested that his one claim to fame was that he was the least productive writer in the English language. But he was cute. So, however, as he suffered more and more from writer's block, he became more and more frustrated and turning to alcohol until he developed full blown alcoholism. So much so that when he had kind of a minor wrist surgery at age of 36, he died because the anesthesia commingled with his very high blood alcohol blood levels, and he didn't survive the surgery. So that left Peggy kind of at loose ends. So at this point, she's about 35 years old, twice married. She had lived this very wild life, very connected with very stimulating men that proved ultimately to be quite unproductive. Her life was one about passion and insalubrity or unhealth. Finally, it was a friend that actually suggested to her that she needed to, do something with herself. And the friend said, "Why don't you, start a publishing company or open an art gallery?" And she decided that a publishing house would be too expensive and too much work. So she opted for the former option. And her mother had just died and left her even more money. So she decided to turn her attention and open an art gallery. Now, the only problem with opening an art gallery is that she knew nothing about modern art. In fact, she preferred Renaissance art to anything else. However, she was well connected. And while the last 10 years had basically been spent with writers, she did meet some artists. And she decided to turn particularly to Marcel Duchamp, who she had become particularly good friends with in the wild 20s in Paris. Duchamp, of course, was a very famous artist. He had been famous in the United States since 1913 when he exhibited his famous nude descending a stairwell at the Armory show in New York, which was absolutely notorious because no one in America had seen Cubist work up until this point, making him kind of an overnight success scandal. And then, of course, he started doing his ready-mades, which were also that he exhibited in the United States, which, of course, also kind of blew the top off the art world when he exhibited The Fountain, a urinal at an art gallery, throwing the whole art world into question, which, of course, was the actual point of it. Duchamp also had been an advisor. He was an advisor to Louise and Walter Arnsberg, and also to Catherine Dreyer. And we've come across her before in Art and Context lecture series. Catherine Dreyer was the aunt of Theodore Dreyer, who, along with John Andrew Rice, founded Black Mountain College. And you might recall, it was old Aunt Kate that had actually suggested that they hire Joseph Albers to be head of school at Black Mountain College. So she was, very kind of connected. In the 1920s, Duchamp and Man Ray had actually worked with Catherine Dreyer, kind of advising her on building a collection through a collecting group that they called the Société Anonyme, which was basically a collection of abstract works of art that they kind of built together and then showed at different venues around the United States. They showed the Société Anonyme group in Brooklyn in 1926. which included 300 works of art. So it was a very kind of cutting edge art exhibition group. And as you can see here, it included the works of Joseph Albers, Alexander Calder, Alexander Archipalenko, uh, Ashville Gorky, a really eclectic array of both European and American artists in the 1920s. So that's who she asked to help her, which was incredibly shrewd. She's very, very smart in tapping her friends and advisors. So in 1937, Duchamp became Peggy Guggenheim's advisor and fulfilled a similar role that he had for Catherine Dreyer. Peggy also is going to hire a friend of hers named Wynne Henderson to be her assistant, and she's going to come up with the clever name Guggenheim Jeune, which is a riff on the famous Bernheim Jeune Gallery, which you may remember was the gallery that represented Matisse. So in this way, we see her kind of referencing this kind of famous European gallery and also an homage to her family name. Her uncle, Solomon Guggenheim, was a great collector of abstract art, and so there was kind of a nod to this. And so through Marcel Duchamp, he encourages her to set up her gallery. She does so in the heart of Piccadilly, and he encourages her to have a first exhibition on works by the playwright Jean Cocteau. And at the time, Cocteau will have just had a big opening of one of his films in Paris, and we see him here with his new discovery, Jean Marais, who will be one of the most famous actors in France during this period and will also be Cocteau's lover. So there's going to be many images of Marais throughout this exhibition, including a really kind of sexually explicit, racy drawing that will be placed in the back that Peggy will kind of take kind of preferred guests to go and check out, which is kind of interesting and racy and titillating that they choose this as her first exhibition. And it's also like speaks to her, fearlessness right out of the bat, in, breaking social decorum and having really no fear of being edgy. At the time, Peggy had started dating the author Samuel Beckett, who had just published a popular book of poetry. He was, of course, Irish, and like her, had spent, many years living in France. And she actually hired him to translate the Cocteau catalog into English. And while he's working on it, they strike up this like passionate romance. Everything's always passionate with her. I know. By this point, she's like earning a reputation, right? As a liberated woman, meaning like a sexual woman, which was a fraught phenomenon in the 1930s. Later, she claimed that she was a nymphomaniac and bragged that she spent 4 days in bed with Beckett, getting up only to receive room service. Was this true? Who cares, right? Yes, it was. She was independently wealthy and independent. Having adopted France as her home, which of course was widely liberal in the 1920s, and she was a woman of her time in that regard, but one that did not conform to the American ideals of womanhood. So that's kind of part of this. What's going on? Well, she had a convenient arrangement with Lawrence Vale, and they become good friends through this. And so he would take them sometimes, and she would take them. So in a way, it was a very kind of progressive, modern dynamic. Um, at about this time, as she's kind of in between shows, there is a really important exhibition on in Paris the International Exhibition of Surrealism, which really is going to kind of solidify surrealism as a major art movement in France. It was a show organized by André Breton, very significant because it was a real group show, establishing kind of a group of artists around a singular movement. Peggy was aware of the show at the time through Marcel Duchamp, who was not at this important exhibition because he was in London with her, setting up her current show, which was a exhibition of the work of Vasily Kandinsky. And here we have a few photos. There is Peggy, so she's growing. She's hanging around the gallery as her mom's getting things ready. It was an important exhibition and an important choice. This was Kandinsky's first solo show in London. He was an artist that Duchamp had advised Catherine Dreyer to buy his work. And it was also an artist that her uncle Solomon had, been collecting and was really kind of interested in. And at this point, Peggy calls Uncle Solomon to see if he might be interested in buying a Kandinsky from her from this show. And he patched her through to his aide-de-camp, Hilda Rebay, who criticized Peggy for dragging down the Guggenheim name for commerce, that she would have a gallery rather than a museum, and refused to buy anything from her. Although somewhat ironically, this painting that was purchased by another dealer from her at that show ultimately was purchased by the Solomon Guggenheim collection. So, given the kind of hype around surrealism, it's not surprising that Peggy's next show would be an exhibition of sculpture that would feature the works of the surrealists. And once again, this is Marcel Duchamp's idea. And she organizes to have these two works as part of her show, one by Hans or Jean Arp, he's one and the same person, and a work by Constantine Brancusi. The show also featured the work of Alexander Calder, who of course is an American artist working in Paris, and Antoine Pevsner. So the sculptures, all of these artists lived in Paris, and so their works had to be, boxed up and then shifted and sent to London. But they experienced problems at British Customs, causing a scandal that's going to help publicize Peggy's gallery. The director of the Tate Gallery, James Mason, basically refused to certify the sculptures as works of art, and therefore they were subject to import duties. He went so far as to call Brancusi's Sculpture for the Blind, idiotic and not art. And of course, this caused a huge uproar. Art critics signed petitions. Finally, the House of Commons got involved, calling for a vote to let these works come through duty-free. So it was a whole, kind of publicity explosion around this. So by the time the exhibition opened, the show was famous. And the Tate director stepped down, and that was kind of the end. It was kind of this important moment, and she was really kind of at the heart of it. And then Jean Arp came to the opening in London to everyone's delight. Also, the British sculptor Henry Moore had some works at this exhibition and was forever grateful to Peggy for including him in the show alongside these kind of European surrealists. So, and as a result of this, the Guggenheim Jeune really became a kind of a catalyst for a growing appreciation for modern art in England. Because of Peggy's great success with the sculpture show and all the publicity around it, she continued to keep working with the surrealists, and she held a series of one-man shows, getting to know the artists of the group better. They were her kind of people. They were avant-garde, funny, irreverent, apparently also super sexy. She ended up having a show of the work of Yves Tanguy, who she found adorable, hilarious, and super attractive. Before long, the two were having a passionate affair, even though Eve's wife, Jeanette, was suspicious of Peggy, who kept finding excuses to sneak off with her husband. And this was all quite an awkward arrangement because Peggy, didn't want to break up their marriage. That wasn't her intention here. She was kind of just a liberated woman. But it was also really complicated by the fact that Tanguy's paintings weren't really selling that well in general, but Peggy was able to find sales for them, bringing Yves Tanguy and his wife well-needed income. And of course, here we see his work. This is very typical of the surrealist painting style at the time. We see Tanguy has developed this very kind of distinctive kind of lunar effect here, featuring kind of almost mineral formations that also allude to kind of prehistoric ages, with these kind of references of kind of fossilized bones that merge into this dreamlike space. This kind of hallucinatory quality was very much kind of interest to these surrealist artists in the mid 1930s. So, but despite the notoriety and the success of these shows, overall, Burnham Guggenheim Jeune was not a financial success. And it was really at this point that Peggy first began to consider kind of forgoing the gallery end of this and opening up a museum of modern art in London. And she was thinking of loosely basing this on MoMA in New York. And so once again, she's so clever, she kind of reaches out to the art community that she's knows and now has established relationships with to kind of advise her in this. She reaches out to the like, of course, Marcel Duchamp, who's always a close advisor, but also the art historian, Kenneth Clark, a fellow surrealist enthusiast and writer, Walter Penrose, who's going to be a very important host to surrealist artists in the UK. And also Herbert Reed, who is a whip-smart and savvy art critic who is going to write catalogs and books on surrealism, one of the very first to do so in English. So with these kind of contemporary thinkers and art insiders in London, we're going to see Peggy and these people creating a list of artists and artworks and potential exhibitions that they would like in the acquiring of works for a new museum. And this list is going to be prove to be incredibly important to Peggy Guggenheim. And so at this point, she's going to shut down the gallery in London, and she's going to go to Paris, list in hand, to begin negotiating the loan of artworks for her new museum that she's setting up in London. And here she is in London in a fabulous apartment of an artist, Kay Sage. She sublets it to her. It's an apartment on the Ile de Saint Louis, right there next to Notre Dame Cathedral. And so she kind of sets herself up there. She also meets up with her Parisian friends to talk to them about her list that she has, including Nellie Van Doesburg. And here's a photograph of her, who is the wife of Theo Van Doesburg, who's part of the Destaille movement, friends with Piet Mondrian, kind of gets her involved in kind of winnowing down this list, also reaches out to Sonia Delaunay, her husband Robert, who are great, inside art, French art insiders, getting their suggestions about the list, really kind of, actively building this. And she has about $40,000 to spend on basically a seed money for her museum. And so she kind of gets to work starting to visit artists that she has on this list. And so from 1938 onward, she is going to spend her time visiting artist studios, buying works of art, oftentimes buying works of art on a daily basis. living in the apartment, kind of living her best life. She's going to invite people over, once again, putting herself in the center of the Parisian action. She's going to have dinner parties, made many social connections. And it's a pretty somber time. We're in 1939. Very perilous peace with the Germans has been meted out through a Vichy government. It was also very strange times in Europe as well. In 1937, the Nazis had held their famous degenerate art show. The exhibition presented 650 works of art confiscated from German institutions. The show featured works of degenerate artists, basically works that insult German feeling or destroy or confuse natural form or simply reveal an absence of adequate manual and artistic skill. The show targeted, of course, modern artists from across Europe, including Henri Matisse had works in this, Marc Chagall, Vincent van Gogh, the German Expressionists, the Surrealists were all included in this, as were many modernists. And the show was like incredibly popular. The mass public was drawn to this. They found modern art to be incomprehensible. And now they had over 1 million people come through to check this out within the first 6 weeks. And there was, of course, there was like African art. So there was all sorts of kind of racist overtones going on. And as you can imagine, this was an incredibly alarming event to the artists across Europe that feared themselves to be, to be guilty of crimes against immorality. So in that context, and given the zeitgeist of the time, it's not surprising that there were many modern art works available and cheap on the art market. And Peggy Guggenheim was one of the only people out there wanting to buy. So it was an incredibly, good time for her to be buying works of art. And Peggy went directly to the artists. She had her list. She knew what she was after. She had always been a great admirer of Constantine Brancusi, who had always charged very high prices for his work. She went to visit the artist many times in his studio. She had been able to buy the Maestra work from a friend during this period, but she had her eye on Brancusi's Bird in Space, which she will go on to say was one of her most favorite works that she ever purchased. She haggled him over the price. He held firm at $4,000 for this work of art. She haggled him and ultimately agreed to spend $4,000, but 4,000 francs, not $4,000, saving her about $1,000. She was able to snatch up many deals during this time by, key and major surrealist artists like Salvador Dali. She was able to purchase his Birth of Liquid Desires, and she bought this one directly from Dali's wife, Gala, who more and more was taking over the business end of Dali's work. And of course, this work is one of his most famous works. It's a great example of his paranoid critical period, which basically conveyed his deepest psychological conflicts in this fastidiously detailed painterly style. He places us in this weird landscape with this kind of, they keep describing it as hermaphroditic creature in the background, but it's so strange. What it is we have these levers in the center, and this was done when Dali met Gala for the first time and started dating her, and we're going to learn more about her next week. She was very much at the center of the avant-garde surrealist scene, and Salvador Dali's father, Salvador Dali, didn't like her at all, was deeply suspicious of her, and didn't want his son to have anything to do with her. And so this work is believed to be, about his kind of fear of his father, and this kind of couple in the center here, representative of Dali, and then these kind of shadows cast as being kind of the fear of the father, kind of usurping or inserting himself into their love affair. Anyways, it's a very strange painting. Apparently, Peggy didn't like the work at all, but because Dali's name was on the list, she went forward with this sale. She also went to visit the surrealist sculptor Alberto Giacometti and purchased this work, Women with Her Throat Cut, from 1932. And she continued to go directly to artist studios, buying from them during the kind of tumultuous days of war. This disturbing piece was purchased as the Germans were advancing onto the city. It's a very shocking work with this kind of typical surrealist juxtaposition of kind of displacement and distortion of anatomical parts, where we see here like a body looks like it's splayed open or disemboweled, arched in a paroxysm of either sex or death. Helping, it's a very well-known surrealist sculpture, but you can't help but wonder, did Peggy buy this one because she liked it or because it was on the list? The day Hitler stormed into Norway in 1939, she walked into Fernand Léger's studio in Paris and bought this work for $1,000. It's a work from 1919. I guess Léger never got over the fact that she would buy a painting on such a terrible day. And she, of course, had no qualms. And in many ways, the artist needed her. They were desperate for money, and she provided them with income at a point that, she was really, they really needed it. And she will buy about 50 works of art, scoring incredibly good deals, major works that she's going to have with her for the rest of her life. And she will spend her $40,000. As the war progressed, Peggy decided to leave Paris and join her children in Grenoble. Also, she's Jewish, of course, and she was in serious danger during this period in 1939. She is going to pack up her collection and move with her husband and children, getting out of the kind of hot zones of the city. While she was there, she got a phone call from a friend, Kay Sage, who she had sublet the apartment from, and she asked her if she would be willing to help some surrealists get out of Europe. André Breton, the head of the surrealist movement, as well as Max Ernst, one of the major surrealist artists who was a German national and was running into all sorts of problems. He had been put into an internment camp in France for German nationals, and they wanted to get him out of Europe to the United States. And she said that she would help him. And so she and her family are kind of organizing, transferring out of Europe and returning to the United States. So Max Ernst is going to have a big impact on her life at this point. And there he is. He is, as I mentioned, he was an incredibly important surrealist artist with a real important kind of pedigree with the group that they all rallied around. And we're going to talk about him more next week because he is also very much connected to Leonora Carrington, who we're going to be studying as one of our surrealist women artists. He was really famous. He was a Dada artist originally, living in Zurich, and he'll be part of that world. Well, he will do works like this, these kind of collages of juxtapositions of this is a kind of a German plane that's been exploded with this weird juxtaposition of kind of a floating fish and then this weird boat. Everything is floating, speaking to the annihilation and decimation of the events of World War I. He'll be embraced by the surrealist group. Gala Uliard and Paul Uliard will support him, and he will actually be involved in a menage a trois relationship with them for a period of time. He will be the master designer of what is called the frottage technique, where the surrealists will embrace this as an important way of kind of having direct channeling of one's artistic impulses and embracing chance by basically rubbing crayons on a wooden base. He used his the floorboards of his apartment, creating these kind of you know how it does these striations, and then turning this as a source into works of art. And he's kind of embraced for this, and he's going to be incredibly important and basically a you know, leading light in the surrealist movement, you know, kind of surrealist royalty, if you will, a bona fide star of the surrealist team in 1940. He himself called himself Lop Lop, King of the Birds. That was his alter image, ego. You know, he was kind of in a troubled state at the time that Peggy Guggenheim, you know, met with him. Of course, she's going to buy works of art from him. And as you can probably guess, she is going to start a passionate affair with him. Is going to basically fund him and his wife, his son Max. She's going to pay for their passage. She's going to actually rent or buy, I don't know, get a one of those. I guess it's like a Pan Am plane that's going to, you know, lands on water, and then she's going to get passage for them, her kids, Lawrence Vale, his Max Ernst, Andre Breton, his son, and they're going to fly out via Portugal. But they have plenty of time kind of waiting for everything to line up where they're going to kind of engage in their romance. And off they go, leaving Paris, and they're going to land in New York. We're going to take our break, and then we're going to talk about what happens in New York when we get back. Okay. Okay. Are we ready? Okay. Okay, so Max and Peggy, right, are passionate affair on. They get on their Pan Am plane, privately chartered, head to New York. And here they come. Peggy arrives in New York with a big hat in 1941. And probably no surprise, Peggy will take America by storm, creating basically a nexus of, or a hub really, of European artists around her. Upon arrival, Peggy and Max Ernst decide to get married, mostly part to immigration issues revolving around the fact that Ernst was a German national and was vulnerable to deportation. But it was a little bit tricky because in her mind they were getting married, and in his mind it was a marriage of convenience. So that never really goes down well. Um, Max becomes the kind of the center of her life during this period. They're going to go on this epic trip around the United States. They're going to travel out to Los Angeles. They're going to go through the American Southwest, which he is going to fall in love with, particularly, you know, Arizona, Sedona area. New Mexico. He's going to start buying Native American works of art that he's going to love. Then they're going to kind of resettle back in New York. She's going to buy a big, beautiful brownstone, a large enough house for him to have a studio, for her to have space to show her collection. And they're going to have many like legendary parties there, entertain, you know, immigrants from Europe, a lot of surrealists. It's just going to be good times. But sadly for Guggenheim, Ernst was more interested in the marriage, or saw the marriage more as a marriage of convenience or a business arrangement. that he appreciated very much. After all, he became very well connected at MoMA, became very friendly with Alfred Barr via Peggy Guggenheim. MoMA's going to buy a lot of his work. But on a personal level, their relationship became quite strained. All that passion that they had turned into kind of passion it fights, how that works. And then also, Ernst was a womanizer. He loved women, and women loved him. And he was just coming off this like very intense love affair that he had with Leonora Carrington, who we see here, who is very young and gorgeous. I think she's like 20 years old and they had been in a very passionate love affair. Everything's passionate with the surrealists, right? And she was actually in New York at the same time, although she also had remarried. She had suffered from literally like a emotional, mental breakdown after she split with Max Ernst. So she was pretty much done with him. But she was very much on his mind, which was difficult for Peggy, who was very jealous of her. During this time, Max Ernst does these works, both of which Peggy will buy. The work in 1940 was done when they were actually in Portugal waiting to get out. This is it's believed that this is Max Ernst kind of processing this kind of triangle that he's in with these two women. Here is this kind of woman in this incredible, fabulous red bird cloak. This is supposedly Peggy Guggenheim. Here is Max Ernst, the Bird King Lop Lop, who appears here with a broken sword, right? Kind of impotent but sharp. And here is Leonora Carrington, gorgeous, young, with this kind of beautiful, like butterfly wing-like hair, who was turning and fleeing the scene. He returns to this in New York after, where we have this kind of interesting horse who has come across the scene of the same woman now in the red kind of bird cloak. And then we see these figures here, perhaps images of Leonora, kind of wistfully moving off, separated, and then this odd figure in the middle. So, processing this kind of love triangle. Yes, so that's what's going on. Things are going bad with Max, but they're going well for her. She decides she's going to be on top of her dream of opening a museum in New York. But she's thinking she'll do a hybrid museum concept. And she's going to find the space. I mean, now she's in her own city. She's got she always has a lot of contacts. I mean, this is the story of a woman with an incredible Rolodex, right? She's going to, she has the European sensibility or the connections, and she now is within New York. She's going to hire a very experimental Viennese architect named Frederick Kiesler to design a space for her. A kind of hybrid space that is both gallery and museum. Museum in the sense that it's going to have about 4 rooms, and 2 of the rooms will be for the permanent display of her collection that she'll kind of rotate around. And then she'll have kind of front rooms that are going to be more for the exhibition of kind of contemporary artists. And and this architect is extremely kind of cutting edge, comes up with all these really interesting ideas for her gallery that she is going to name Art of This Century. It's going to open in fall 1942 on West 57th Street. And in opening this space like this, she was directly engaging with her uncle Solomon, who had opened his Museum of Non-Objective Painting on East 54th Street in 1939. So there's that thing going on. Peggy's space was incredibly avant-garde, and it is believed that perhaps motivated Uncle Solomon to hire Frank Lloyd Wright the next year to design his extraordinary freestanding building that we know today as the Guggenheim on Fifth Avenue. Now, the gallery that Kiesler designed for her, and this is some images that we see here, her, of course, looking so cool, sitting there within it. It's really like the first time that you can think of these kind of like, art space as experience. Now this is kind of a whole new aspect of art spaces. And I think of like something like Bilbao or something where we have this like, an interesting kind of architectural place that draws people to it. And here we see this kind of interior. He saw it as this kind of experiential place where it was kind of an open space where he had scrims that he designed, different screens that you could hang works of art that you can see here are tied down with ropes, and then also various ropes hanging down, which would be a way in which art could be attached and then hung. Also, the Coriolis chair that he designed could be turned on different aspects. You'd be turned this way to be a chair, or turned on its side could be an easel as a way to show art, or upside down as a way to display sculpture. He designed music, the sound, well, not music, sounds that one would experience when they were in the gallery, like an oncoming train, the whistle of an oncoming train to kind of put people on edge. There was also a peekaboo space where you would have to peer in to look at the work of art. And I'm showing you Marcel Duchamp's Attente Donnée from 1946, done afterwards. This is a work that those of you that went to Philadelphia with me, we had the experience of kind of looking in. And I'm not showing you the entire piece, by the way. But this kind of idea of like peephole, which was kind of part of the surrealist experience. The floors were painted aqua, kind of greens. It was really kind of, interesting and strange, and people loved it. And it kind of brought in lots of people into the gallery and was very, very popular. She also, Peggy, had become quite sophisticated at this point in the promoting of the gallery. And she had a group of her artist friends come, these are mostly surrealists from Europe, come to do kind of a promotional photograph as part of her very shrewd publicist campaign. And here we see, a who's who of who is in New York in the surrealists. Here's Max Ernst. Here's his son, Jimmy. Peggy is next to John Farren, who was another American surrealist. Here's Marcel Duchamp. Piet Mondrian was there. Here is an English photographer. Her name is Bernice Abbott, Fernand Léger, André Breton, the mastermind of surrealism, Amédée aux Enfants. Here is Stanley Hayter. He was a printmaker, British printmaker, surrealist. Leonora Carrington is here. The architect, Frederick Kiesler. Kurt Sigelman was an Austrian surrealist. So, and it's a very kind of posed photograph, right, where we see her, organizing it. Gives you an idea, right, of how, extraordinary this moment is in New York with all of these Europeans there. It's one of her very first and really one of the most interesting shows that she has from this era is an exhibition called 31 Women, which was a show entirely dedicated to women, which was not done. This was a new phenomenon. Although I must add that the show was juried by men, so that's kind of disturbing. But she still gets credit for having the show. It's a major exhibition in the history of women in art. There were so few shows like it. This was a show that showed the work of that's not Peggy Guggenheim, that's Leonora Carrington's work. Sorry, that was a mistake. The Horses of Lord Candlestick. It featured the work of Merritt Oppenheim, Louise Nevelson had works in the show. And Peggy Guggenheim kind of sometimes can get a bad rap in her relationships with women, basically being kind of like a homebreaker, right? With all of her affairs, with her promiscuous love life. But really, she was an incredible promoter of women on a professional level. She hired women, she included them in her shows. In fact, 40% of the artists who exhibited at Art of the Century were women. I'm sorry, this is ticking. I don't know what to do. She had also many solo shows of women. And so she kind of got her 31 artists together of who she was going to include. And she made perhaps a poor choice in asking her womanizing husband, Max Ernst, to be the one to go to all of the artist studios and then pick the work of art that he thought that should be included. And when he got to the fabulously gorgeous studio of Dorothea Tanning, a young American artist who was profoundly influenced by the Surrealists, particularly the work of Max Ernst, he took a great interest in a self-portrait that she had made, Birthday, that he found a must work. And of course, will proceed to fall madly in love with, passionately, yes, thank you, passionately in love with Dorothea Tanning. He loved this self-portrait that she had made called Birthday, you know. And Peggy, of course, was quite hurt by this affair. She tried to retaliate, good honor, by having an affair with Marcel Duchamp, but I guess it didn't really work out because he was more like her dad than like a lover, so that fizzled out fast. And finally, the final straw is when Dorothea Tanning wore a dress with kind of cutouts where you would look in would be the face of Max Ernst at a gallery opening where all of their friends were there, that she had had enough, and that was it. She and Peggy, she will divorce him. And then Max Ernst went on to marry Dorothea Tanning, and they lived together for 30 years, splitting their time between Sedona and New York. Back to Art of this Century, she had a really important exhibition of collage works. And again, this was quite new and experimental. In fact, it was the first international exhibition of collage held in the United States. And the show is going to feature works by Pablo Picasso, Kurt Schwitters, huge, important European artists who worked in collage. But she's also going to open up to a significant number of American artists. Artists like Joseph Cornell, who is going to kind of come onto the scene in New York for the first time. Robert Motherwell, who was a newcomer. He sends this work along with another new artist, Jackson Pollock. Sadly, his collage no longer exists, so I'm showing you this photograph, but he sent an experimental collage. In fact, Robert Motherwell and Jackson Pollock weren't collage artists, but they heard about the show, and so they whipped back to their studios to whip together some collages. Well, not whipped them together, but made some collages so they could be included in this exhibition. Which was a great success and was, a good move on their part, because Jackson Pollock basically is going to, become part of the fold of Peggy Guggenheim's gallery. At the time, he was working kind of as a custodian / construction exhibition builder at Peggy's uncle's Museum of Non-Objective Painting at the time. And at the collage show, Pollock's work was really singled out by the Surrealist artists. All of Peggy's friends were like, wow, this guy's work is really good. And so she included him in a spring salon for young artists that she had, and he sent this work. And once again, the Surrealists were like, wow, this guy is really, really talented. In fact, they were so enthusiastic about him they encouraged him. They said, you need to, offer this guy a contract. And so she did, which was very unusual for her. She basically paid him a monthly stipend for his work that he would produce. And they continued for this arrangement for the next several years, which is incredibly insightful of her because, of course, we see these are going to be really important paintings as we see Jackson Pollock kind of moving through this kind of more kind of surrealist mode into more action painting and ultimately his drip style painting. This was a work that he did kind of in 1943 when he first met his future wife, Lee Krasner. And it kind of has been explained as a reclining nude with a head in profile there in the left-hand side here, and then this kind of foot that we can see here with these scratchy calligraphic lines on the surface. And this, I think, is what drew the most praise by many of the surrealists. Here it is again, and they just love the work. So Peggy is going to continue to, Piet Mondrian also loved Jackson Pollock's works. He described it as the most interesting work I've seen so far in America. And because, and this was also affirmation for her move to ask to get Pollock under contract. So her marriage breaks up about this time. She sells the big brownstone and she moves into another house now without Max Ernst. And the first thing she's going to do is going to commission her new contracted artist, Jackson Pollock, to paint a large mural for her new home. And this is the work, Mural. It's the largest piece that he ever completed. Marks a very dramatic shift in his working style from, mural size to canvas size to huge mural. It's 8 by 20 foot across, and it's actually on canvas. So he did it off site and then rolled it up and brought it in. And in it, we can see that kind of calligraphic quality again, right? That ultimately is going to find its way into his splatter works. It's also kind of a legendary painting. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Pollock featuring Ed Harris, but this mural, was believed or was kind of presented as being this kind of seminal work that he did in one night that was meant to kind of shift his entire style for one, driven more by his mentor, Thomas Hart Benton, to this new kind of abstraction. It's then Peggy Guggenheim gifted it to the University of Iowa, and since then they've done extensive work on the painting, and they know that it wasn't done in one night, that it was a long process in creating this, actually months of work. But we can see kind of a whole new shift has occurred for this artist. Later that year, she held a one-man show for Jackson Pollock, a show that really puts him on the map. The critic Clement Greenberg stated that he could not find strong enough words of praise for the show, and he is going to herald Jackson Pollock as the artist of his generation. And this review is going to have a tremendous impact on Jackson Pollock. And it's going to encourage him to kind of continue with his experimental style. And here is another work that he does in 1945, where we see him kind of amplifying these kind of painterly strokes. This becomes like action painting now, which will morph next into drip painting. Jackson Pollock was kind of a tricky artist for Peggy. She always said she rescued him from obscurity working behind the scenes at his uncle's studio, his uncle's museum. But at the same time, he was a horrible alcoholic. And he wasn't the kind of artist that you could bring collectors over to visit to help sell your work. I mean, he was so drunk that he would be like peeing in the corner type of drunk, like not a good, I don't know. Is there a good drunk? I don't know, but um, he was the bad kind of drunk. So, yeah. Interestingly, Lee Krasner, who he married, during this period recognized that he was becoming more and more famous, and his drinking was becoming, more and more intense. And so she made the decision to move him out of Manhattan, and she bought the property on Long Island and Amagansett, so you can go and visit that today. But she didn't have the money for the down payment, so she asked Peggy for the money, and she vacillated. She didn't really know, what to do. But once again, all the artists were like, you need to help him. And interestingly, I was reading this, but John, you can do more research. I think there recently has been a lawsuit between the estate of Peggy Guggenheim and Lee Krasner's estate, because she had him under contract during this period, so that meant she owned the works. But I think Lee Krasner kept like about 5 paintings and never told her. And now they're going to war in the courts. So, but John can look it up and make any corrections if I get it wrong. It wasn't just Jackson Pollock. She was also had other really important American artists involved with her at this time. In fact, she had over 55 shows at the Art of the Century featuring the works of really important artists, abstract expressionists. The young Americans were there, including Mark Rothko and Clifford Still were showing with her at her gallery. Mark Rothko showed this work, a really important painting, Untitled, in 1947. And he's really starting to kind of arrive at his mature style, this is probably how you know and see a Mark Rothko at the museum today. Basically, he's kind of working out this kind of horizontal bands in this work that ultimately, he will land upon and do and work through for the next 20 years. All of these kind of luminous fields of color, inspired by the principles of religious formality, frontality, iconic imagery. And indeed, for me at least, these canvases really inspire a sense of kind of great wonder and reverence. And even I was just at the Rothko Chapel in Houston not too long ago, and even in black, Mark Rothko excites me. Passionately interested in him. It's true, I am. The work of Clifford Still also was going through kind of a real formative shift at this time. If you don't know Clifford Still as much, I mean, he's a really important abstract expressionist. He was recognized at the time as really the master of the medium. And you see in his Jamais that Peggy showed and owned, he's kind of working into this kind of expressionistic style with these kind of very intense verticals in his work that ultimately are going to morph into this kind of abstract style that we see there on the right with these kind of jarring color juxtapositions. So, this is a really formative painting that she has and really important. And Clifford Still is interesting because he ultimately will kind of remove himself from the art world. He thinks the whole thing wasn't for him. And so he kind of moved away and worked in obscurity for most of his life, even though he was kind of celebrated as the preeminent abstract expressionist artist. And then he kept all of his works, or most of them, and then he looked around, tried to find a city that would be willing to take his collection, and with the caveat being that they would have to build a museum just for his collection. And I think some of you already know that city was Denver, Colorado, agreed to take his collection. And I, honest to God, the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, I think is really it's one of my favorite museums in the world. It's magnificent. And it goes from room to room and it shows, his transition. And then his canvases are just spellbinding and powerful and really special. When Peggy closed her gallery the following year, after in 1957, Clifford Still wrote, Peggy was the only one doing an honest job at this time. She was doing something personal. The closing of her gallery after the 1946-47 season was the biggest loss to the art world. In 1945, when the war came to an end, Peggy decided to return to Europe, first to London, and then she took her children, and she decided that she wanted to go to Venice. She did come back for a short period of time, and to kind of tie up loose strings, if you will. And before wrapping up shop, she had a final exhibition for Jackson Pollock, and this work was shown at her fourth solo exhibition for this artist, obviously confirming Peggy's prescience in giving him so much financial support. Of course, his works, here we see it, widely experimental, his drip style now established. And, as I say, he was no easier to deal with at this point than he was earlier in his career. He was a challenging artist to take on, but she managed to help him to get representation, and he connected with Betty Parsons, who took him on as one of her artists. So now she's back free again. She's kind of rocked New York, and she's off with her collection. And off she went and decided she would go to Venice, Italy, with her collection in tow. She was living in temporary housing at the time, her paintings all in crates as she's kind of ready to get her life back together. When a friend, once again, suggested that she connect with the Secretary General of the Venice Biennale about showing her work at this large, Italian art show. The Venice Biennale had been in existence since the 19th century, but it only became the Biennale since 1942, kind of the show of the international art scene. It just so happened that the Greek pavilion was vacant for this show because it was currently in war with Turkey. So they agreed to let Peggy bring her collection and display it at the area reserved for the country of Greece. And there she is with her Collezione Peggy Guggenheim, promoted as a highlight of the Biennale. It represented the most comprehensive survey of abstract and surrealist art ever presented in Italy at the time. It was also the first time that large American abstract works had ever been seen in Europe. Basically, it gave the Europeans an opportunity to kind of catch up on what was going on in the United States. It was a huge success. The president of Italy came to visit the show. The American ambassador came. Important art critics, art world people came to fet her. Later, she said, my exhibition had enormous publicity, and the pavilion was one of the most popular highlights of the Biennale. What I enjoyed most was seeing the name Guggenheim appearing next to the name Britain, France, and Holland, as I thought as if I was a new European country. Her good friend Lee Miller, a surrealist photographer, came and photographed her there, and we see her really, truly happy in these works. She's such a chameleon, right, in these photographs. I think she must be in her 50s, right? Late 50s? Yeah, 50s. I bet 50s. Yeah, she's 50 because she's born in 1998, and this is 1948. Thanks to the creative ingenuity of her accountant, who managed to perform the inheritance law version of a magic trick, Peggy Guggenheim found herself purchasing a palazzo in Venice. She bought the Palazzo Venier de Leoni, a building that had been begun in the 18th century on the Grand Canal in the Dorsoduro district of Venice. It had been the home of the aristocratic Venier family, a house that had never been finished. It was long and wide, as you can see it here, and had one of the largest gardens. It has one of the largest gardens in Venice. Also, because the building had officially never been finished, it was considered a work in progress, therefore was not subject to the very strict rebuilding and remodeling laws for Venetian historical structures. Therefore, Peggy was able to do massive remodeling in the interior of the palazzo, basically creating a very modern interior which would be appropriate for the showing of her collection. She also added a pavilion and a garden and installed her paintings and sculptures within her palazzo. Which was very elegant and historical on the exterior and very sparse and modern in the interior. And there she is. She's going to live her best life in this palazzo for the next 30 years. She is going to live there. In the early years of her arrival, she's going to be particularly glamorous and social. She held weekly salons. Her home became a must-visit stop for all the privileged and influential people that came to Venice. She installed her collection there. In the palazzo inside and out, and from that point onward, the collection was seen. She actually had free days for the public to come in the afternoon, 3 days a week. She kept a important guest book. Here she is in the interior, so you can see some of the rooms were kind of smaller to scale. One of her favorite Did I disconnect? Okay, good. Yeah. Oh, she kept a guest book that became like this treasured item for her, filled with signatures of notables, art world VIPs. When the Biennale would happen, she would have big parties and was really kind of part of that whole thing. She hosted everyone that was everyone, came there. It was really quite a kind of a very nexus for her. In the 1960s, Peggy was still out there becoming more eccentric, less glamorous as she aged, but still maybe cooler than ever. She could be seen here on the canals wearing her signature glasses designed by the artist and sculptor Edward Melcarth, butterfly and bat inspired glasses. She continued to have passionate affairs, of course. She had new friends in this fabulous life. Her collection continued to draw people far and wide. Throughout the 1970s, she actually sent her collection on a European tour at one point. As she aged, she made arrangements for her beloved collection to be transferred to her uncle Solomon R. Guggenheim's foundation, which took ownership of her villa but allowed her to continue to live there, and agreed that at the time of her death it would be preserved and maintained as a collection as she knew it when she was alive. So that is where you go and visit it today. Peggy Guggenheim died 2 days before Christmas in 1979 at the age of 81, and her beloved collection is her great legacy. And we still have a few minutes, so I want to show you the trailer of a movie that maybe you guys can rent tonight at home. It's called Peggy Guggenheim Art Addict. I think it's like an Amazon download, or you can get it from Apple movies or whatever. It's by, this is the trailer to get you excited about it. And it's based on an interview, her last interview that she gave.
It seems to me that you have an intuition for talent even before it's realized.
Yes, maybe.
What do these pictures mean to you yourself?
Oh, they've become more or less the most important part of my life. I can't imagine now living without them.
She'd carved out a niche for herself, and she filled it, and she made it as a collector, and as a kind of collector that never quite existed before.
She wanted this art as a mirror for her own strangeness.
I think sex and art went absolutely hand in hand in her brain.
She was talked about as such a slut for doing the same thing that all the men around her were doing.
Peggy is a sort of model for the liberated woman.
Peggy appealed to me because of her eccentricities. Just a wonderfully colorful family.
The Guggenheims progressed from selling door to door to having these enormous fortunes.
You must have been extremely shocked when your father died on the Titanic.
Yes.
She actually helped artists to leave Europe, to the United States, so she very much saved artists.
You could have wound up in a concentration camp.
Yes, I know that.
She managed to put together one of the great collections of modern art for the almost laughable sum of $40,000.
Some of these prices are subjective because they're so rare. You're talking billions of dollars.
My father showed with her, my mother showed with her. She was a big part of their lives in 1946, when I was 3.
I first met Jackson Pollock when he was working as a carpenter in my uncle's museum. So I rescued him from that.
And how do you feel about walking down the ramp at the Guggenheim Museum and seeing your paintings in a completely different environment?
Oh, my uncle's garage, yes. It looks like a garage, doesn't it? I think if he saw this now, he'd turn in his grave. I came to Venice, which I'd always adored, which had been my dream city.
Did you feel it was a crazy life?
Definitely, yes. It was all about art and love.
Okay, something for you to watch later tonight.